Today I have a very special Christmas edition watercolor class for you. This class consists of 3 mini projects, each one of different skill level: beginner, early intermediate and advanced intermediate. Hello, I'm Yalsari. Welcome to my channel. For the beginner level, we'll be painting simple festive shapes like candy canes. This will help you to learn brush control, create clean edges and basic wet and dry and wet and wet techniques. For the early intermediate level, we'll apply the charging technique, which is one of the wet and wet technique, to repetitive shapes like Christmas lights. We'll create soft glow and create highlights by saving the white of the paper. For the final project, we'll paint a beautiful vibrant red poinsettia. The focus here will be on wet and wet, timing and water control. At the same time, we'll be creating some details on damp paper. But don't worry, it's easier than it seems, and I'll walk you through the whole process. If you're interested, I have the extended version of these 3 tutorials on my channel. I'll put the links in the description box and at the end of the video. The links to the free line drawing and all the supplies used in this video are given in the description box below. So let's start first with the candy cane. My color palette is very simple. It's cadmium red, hooker's green and Payne's gray. Payne's gray I'll be using for the white part of the candy cane and also to darken both cadmium red and hooker's green for the shadow areas. So after applying a layer of water, I'm using a very dilute tea-like consistency to paint the white parts of the candy cane, applying paint only on the outer edges and allowing it to move towards the center on its own. While the paper is still moist, I'm going to use a clean damp brush and a tissue paper to lift color from the areas which are going to be red stripes of the candy cane. To paint the holly leaves, I'm going to use hooker's green and hooker's green mixed with Payne's gray. I'm going to use the wet and wet technique and paint only one half of the leaf at a time. This automatically creates the central vein. First, I'm going to start with hooker's green and Payne's gray mixture, thicker consistency, cream-like consistency, and apply it only on the central vein and the edges of the leaves. And then I'm going to drop in some hooker's green, cream-like consistency as well. Then I use the same wet on wet technique and a thicker consistency of hooker's green and Payne's gray mixture to apply first on the edges of the leaves, and then I use my brush to move the paint around before dropping in some hocus green. Time to paint the red stripes. For this I'm going to use cadmium red and cadmium red mixed with Payne's grey. So I'm using the wet on wet technique here. First I applied a layer of cadmium red and then took some cadmium red mixed with Payne's grey as a shadow color mixture and applied it only on the edges of this part. Then I did the same thing on this second stripe. I'm applying a layer of water and then a layer of cadmium red. Applying on the edges first and allowing the paint to move towards the center. And the paint layer becomes lighter at the center, creating a beautiful highlight. And always, you can also create highlight by lifting color. And while the paper was still moist, I dropped in the shadow colors on both the edges. And repeated the same process for the rest of the red stripes. So first applied a layer of water and then a layer of cadmium red on the edges, allowing the paint to move to the center. If the paint doesn't flow, I'm using my brush to help it flow towards the center. And always remembering to drop in the shadow colors on both sides of the edges. Here I applied a second layer of just cadmium red to brighten it up a little. For the berries I'm using mostly wet and dry. I took a small amount of cream-like consistency of cadmium red and applied it on the outer edges of the berry. Then cleaned my brush and took off the excess water, and with this damp brush I used it to spread the paint, leaving a highlight in the center. Then I applied the shadow color mixture of cadmium red with Payne's gray and applied it on the outer edges of the berry. While the first berry is drying, I am moving on to this other berry which is not in contact with the first one in order to avoid paint bleeding from one area to another. Time to paint the extra thin lines near the red stripes. For this I'm using my 000 round brush and a cream-like consistency of cadmium red. The number of lines I'm painting are random. You can paint 1, 2 or even up to 3 lines on either side of the red stripes. It's totally up to you. For the golden borders, I'm going to use Winsor Newton gold ink. First I'm laying down the washi tape and using a plastic ruler to help me paint the borders quickly. Also, I love the broken edges on the borders. And I did the exact same thing with the remaining borders. And here's the finished painting. And now let's move on to our second project, early intermediate stage Christmas lights. In this video, we are going to focus on the charging technique, which is a wet on wet technique. It only means applying paint on an already painted wet surface and allowing the paint to mix on paper rather than on palette. The charging technique is so much more than just wet on wet. The only requirement to be able to use this technique effectively is the basic understanding of paint to water ratio. In other words, if you can avoid unwanted blooms while painting, then this technique is going to be very easy for you. Since the charging technique is a wet on wet technique, so we need the paper to be wet or moist for as long as possible. Take your time while applying water on your paper. Here, after applying a good glaze of water on the upper part of the bowl, I'm using cadmium red milk-like consistency and size 2 round brush to apply paint all over the area, just leaving a small area on both sides of the bowl unpainted. This is to create some highlight. And while the paper is still moist, I'm using a mixture of cadmium red with neutral tint as a shadow color to apply in all those areas where there can be shadows. In a typical layering technique approach, where you apply several layers to reach the vibrancy and realism that you're looking for, the first layer is very light, tea-like consistency, right? In the charging technique, you can apply as much pigment as you're actually perceiving visually. However, we all know that watercolors have a drying shift, meaning when the watercolors dry, they always look a little bit paler. So even in the charging technique, you will need one more layer. In this layer, you might boost the color or the intensity of the colors by glazing, or you may want to give more detail and definition by using the wet on dry in the second and the final layer. Defining the edges before the paper is dry. For the berries here, I'm using a very light tea-like consistency because I want them to look a little bit pinkish and not steal the focus from the red bow. So after applying water diligently, I'm using a mixture of permanent rose with Winsor blue and taking a milk-like consistency, applying it on the outer edge of the bulb. So basically dropping in the paint near the edges and using my brush to pull that paint towards the center, however leaving a small area in the center with the white paper showing, so that it can act as our highlight. Then I added a small amount of neutral tint to the violet mixture and used it near the base of the bulb and around the edges so that it can create a more three-dimensional look. The paper is still moist, so I'm using my 000 round brush to define and sharpen the edges. I don't have indigo, so I'm using one of my favorite pigments, Prussian blue. So the same technique, I'm using first a milk-like consistency over the edges and the base and pulling the paint towards the center. However, leaving some parts of the central area unpainted with the paper showing through so that it can act as a highlight. Then I added a small amount of neutral tint to Prussian blue, and I'm using this mixture to apply at the base and on the sides. And I'll be using the same charging technique to the rest of the bulbs. First applying the pigment, leaving the central area for highlight, and then creating a mixture of this pigment with neutral tint to create a darker mixture for the shadows, except for the yellow bulb where I used cadmium orange as the shadow color. Allow me to briefly mention some of the benefits of the charging technique. Since you don't need to add, let's say, 7 to 8 layers to your painting, so your paintings are more vibrant and full of light and life. It allows you to accomplish most of your painting in the very first layer, so it accelerates your painting process, and it is a more intuitive and direct approach to watercolors without getting lost in all those layers. But you do need to control very well the water to paint ratio, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video. Time to paint the metallic part on the bulbs. I'm using transparent gold deep for a golden look, but if you prefer silver, you can use a grey mixture. First, I'm using a very dilute consistency of transparent gold deep and applying it over the whole area, wet or dry. The paper is dry so that I can leave some areas with the white paper showing through. Then I took a thicker consistency of transparent gold deep and applied it on the other sides of the metallic area and also on the horizontal lines. Next, I used a mixture of transparent gold deep with neutral tint and my 000 round brush to enhance those horizontal lines. For the electrical cords, I'm using first very dilute sepia. Next, I took my 000 round brush and took a thicker consistency of sepia to create some darker areas. Now that the painting is completely dry, it's ready for its final layer. For this, I'll be using a very dilute consistency and apply a very thin layer, wet on dry, to boost the color. So first I lay down the paint, then clean my brush and remove the excess moisture, and then use this damp brush to spread the paint. To paint the glow from the lights, I am using wet on wet and a very small amount of tea-like consistency of paint, and use my brush to move the paint around. And here's the finished painting. I used a golden metallic brush pen to paint the borders. Now it's time for a final project of advanced intermediate level. Have you ever noticed that when you paint with red, it quickly becomes dull or muddy? It's not because your painting skills are lacking. It's because red is a tricky color. After applying a generous layer of water on this leaf, I laid down some cadmium yellow in the center, followed by cadmium red on the edges of the leaf, and I used my brush to pull the paint towards the center. Then I took some alizarin crimson, laid it down on the area which is in touch with the other leaf. For the shadows, I'm mixing a small amount of Payne's grey to the main pigment. For instance, in this case, cadmium red is the main pigment on this leaf, so I mixed a small amount of Payne's grey to cadmium red, and taking a milk-like consistency of this mixture, applied it on the areas where this leaf is touching the other leaf which is on top of this one, and the areas of the leaf which have a fold or are in the shadow. For the veins, I'm using my liner brush and the shadow color mixture. I could have used any thinner brush, so I want the veins to be there but not too dominant. Therefore, I'm using very light and soft strokes. The paper is still moist. The shine is not totally gone. The consistency is a little bit thicker than the milk-like consistency. For this topmost tier of red leaves, I want them to look brighter and visually closer than the lower ones. So I'm going to use cadmium red and cadmium yellow and no alizarin crimson. Because both cadmium red and cadmium yellow are warm colors, and warm colors come forward. Started by applying a good glaze of water first, and then dropped in cadmium yellow, followed by cadmium red on the edges of the leaf, and then used my brush to pull the paint towards the center. You can always add more paint while the paper is still moist. It will not create any blooms as long as the consistency is thick. For the shadow areas, I used the mixture of cadmium red with Payne's grey and painted the central vein with this mixture. However, the smaller veins on this leaf, I painted them with cadmium red, a thicker consistency. For the flower at the center, I'm using sap green, wet on dry. Paper is dry and the paint is very dilute, like that of tea-like consistency. Then I dropped in some thicker consistency of alizarin crimson, the center of the flowers, and also used the alizarin crimson to paint the small petals around the flower. Then I took a thicker consistency of hocus green to apply at the base of the small flowers. Now I'm adding some clean water droplets with my brush to create watercolor blooms. And then to paint the fold on the sleeve, I used a very diluted alizarin crimson tea-like consistency. Here I'm using a very thick consistency, cream-like consistency of Payne's gray, at which point it almost looks black. I'm using wet on dry technique and filling in all those areas in between petals and leaves. For the background, I wanted something more dynamic and less static, so first I painted the whole of the background with a very light layer of Payne's gray. Once it was completely dry, I applied water on a small area and once again applied a thicker consistency of Payne's gray, and then used my brush to drop in water, but with the painting upright so that the water would flow down. I combined this with snowflakes with white gouache to create some movement in the background so that the background is not so static and it's more interesting to look at. As a finishing touch, I applied a very dilute wash of the same color on some of the petals to boost the intensity and vibrancy. Then I used a very diluted white gouache to create snowflakes by splattering. And here's the finished painting. Thank you very much for watching this video till the end. Please like, share and subscribe if you haven't already. See you next week with a new tutorial. Bye for now.